Good afternoon, everyone. We're just letting people in from the waiting room. We appreciate you joining us. I'll go ahead and get started. We are starting our 2025-26 academic year series of the Ability Grand Rounds. And this, if you haven't joined us, I think many of you have joined us, but if you haven't joined us before, this is a series that we sponsor throughout the year, once a month. And it's an opportunity for the group as peers to talk about our research, training, service related to individuals with disabilities and or their families. And that's at a local, statewide, national, and international, as we see from our speaker today, perspective. Before we get going, I do want to remind everyone that we have closed captioning. It's provided. If you're not sure how to get that going, just put it in the chat, let me know, and I'll help you out with that. Lastly, we have certificates of attendance that we offer, and if you're interested in that, I'll put something in the chat just to remind you, but let me know if that's something that you would be interested. As always, if we're not asking questions or in the middle of a discussion, make sure that your line is on mute just to prevent background noises. In the chat, while we're getting ready, if you could put your name and affiliation, what program you're with, that would be very helpful for us to start to connect. If you're comfortable, use your camera, but we understand not everyone's able to do that or comfortable doing that. And then lastly, feel free, our speaker today said interrupt for a good discussion. So at any point in time, if you had a question or a comment, it is open to interrupt the presentation and ask your question or state your comment. On that point, let me introduce our speaker. I am very excited to introduce Dr. Andreas Haller, and he's a tenure track assistant professor in the economics, the Norwegian School of Economics. He joins us from the University of Zurich, so a time difference there. And we were just talking a little bit of some weather differences. So I've already invited him to West Virginia, and anytime he's able to do that, we're fortunate. So today he's talking to us about economics, and I really appreciate him trying to apply that to many of us who may not come from an economic background. And with that, Dr. Haller, I'll turn it over to you and mute my line. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for joining. So the topic I chose is one paper we just finished that's trying to measure the value of disability insurance. Yeah, and so the first thing I always start with is, why should you care about disability insurance? And the short and simple answer is that these are just very big programs. And so we want to understand how to design them and how to make them better as an insurance. And to illustrate that point, I'm showing you here the share of individuals in the working age population who receive disability benefits. So the dotted line here is Norway, where I'm currently sitting. So when we introduced disability insurance in the 60s, it was around 2% of the working age population receiving disability benefits. And then you see this steady growth over the next 40 years, 50 years, and then by 2010, around 10% of the working age population receives some form of disability benefits in Norway. And still today, 2025, it's around 10% of the working age population receiving benefits. You see a similar trend for the US. They started out at around 1%, and then steady growth, and ended up 2010 at around 5% of the working age population. So that's around the average in the OECD. 5% of the working age population receives disability benefits. So these are very big programs. It's usually the second biggest program after old age pensions, and they're like twice or three times the size of unemployment insurance. And if you look at this picture here, it's basically two questions that pop out. First one is, why did these programs grow so much over the last 50 years? I'm not going to talk about that question at all today. And the second question that comes up, if you look at this picture, is that if you see that 10% of the working age population in Norway are on disability benefits, the question that comes up is, are these programs too big? Are too many people on these programs? And we're going to talk about part of that question. So we're not going to directly answer today, or the paper is not aiming to answer whether these programs are too big or too small. We're going to talk about a very related question, and that's the question of whether disability benefits are too generous or not generous enough. And so what you always hear in the media discussion is that there's this worry that disability benefits are generous or too generous. And so there's a disincentive to work, and there's many people who could actually work, but they go on disability benefits because it's so generous. Yeah? But of course, there's a trade-off when you think about generosity. It's not just the cost and the moral hazard aspect of the insurance, but there's also a value of having these benefits. Okay? So there's always a trade-off between insurance. On the one hand, you want to make disability benefits as generous as possible because they provide insurance against negative health shocks. If you have experience a shock that limits your capacity to work, you want to insure individuals against it. And so benefits should be generous to insure against these risks. But you face that trade-off that you also have this incentive side that if you make them very generous, then it's not attractive to work, and you might see a lot of moral hazard of people going or trying to go on disability benefits without actually having a limiting condition that limits their work capacity. Okay? And so what we're going to think about today is this trade-off between incentives and insurance, and how we can quantify these two things, and in the end, how we should think about generosity. Can we actually say something meaningful based on empirical evidence, whether benefits are too generous or not generous enough? So that's kind of the roadmap for today, trying to figure out whether benefits are too generous or not. And when we economists think about this trade-off, we end up with one very famous formula. It's called the Bailey-Chetty formula. It's actually very intuitive. So the way we think about benefit generosity today is on the margin. So we think about what happens if we make benefits $1 more generous. So on the one hand, if you make benefits $1 more generous, then that's going to cost you $1 mechanically. Make it $1 more generous, it costs you $1. Okay? And on top of that, you might expect that if disability benefits become more generous, that you have a take-up effect, that more people apply to disability benefits, and some of them end up on disability benefits. And so that's measured by this take-up elasticity, that there's more people going on disability benefits. And so in total, this right-hand side of the equation just measures the total cost of increasing benefits by $1. That's the incentive effect. So that could be, for instance, 1.5. Could be mechanically $1 plus an additional 50 cents from the take-up response. Or it could be less, or it could be more. That's just measuring the total impact of making disability benefits $1 more generous. And then the left-hand side, what we call the insurance value, that's measuring the value that is created because you transfer that $1 to individuals who receive disability benefits. Okay? So what happens is if you make it $1 more generous, you're making a transfer from the taxpayer to the disability benefit recipient. Okay? And this ratio here is just a measure of the relative willingness to pay of these two groups. Okay? The bottom part is the marginal utility of consumption of the taxpayer. So that's the willingness to pay for that $1 of the taxpayer. How valuable is that $1 to the taxpayer? And the upper part is the marginal utility of consumption of the disability benefit recipient. That's the willingness to pay for that $1 additional dollar. How much does a DI recipient value that $1 additional dollar? So you can think about this insurance value as just the exchange rate from valuation from the taxpayer relative to the DI recipient. And generally, we would think that this term is larger than one, that the DI recipient who struggles to get along and has a work limitation, that they value additional money more than the average taxpayer who can make ends meet. Yeah? And so the way to think about this formula is just if we could quantify both sides of this equation, we would know kind of the value that is created of the $1 increase and the total cost. And so then we just need to compare value and cost against each other. So if the insurance value, the left-hand side, is bigger than the incentive effect, the costs of the $1 increase, then on net, you create value by making disability benefits more generous. So if the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side, then benefits are not generous enough. You would actually create welfare surplus if you make benefits more generous. If it was the other way around, if the costs are larger than the benefits, then currently DI benefits are too generous, and you would create welfare increases by reducing benefit generosity. And then at the optimum, these two sides are equal. So that's the whole idea of how we think about the incentive insurance trade-off. If we could quantify these two sides of the equation, we would know immediately whether benefits are not generous enough or too generous. And so now the problem is, of course, that it's hard to quantify, especially the left-hand side. This is a ratio of marginal utilities. And so there's no data set, not even in the Norwegian admin data, that would tell us the valuation of $1 of each individual in the population. There's a lot of literature trying to estimate the right-hand side, which is much easier to do, because for the right-hand side, you just need variation in benefit generosity and then see what happens to take-up. And the early literature on disability benefits in economics has worried a lot about this right-hand side, kind of the moral hazard aspect of disability benefits, that if they become more generous, you see a lot of take-up. And generally, this literature finds that if you make DI benefits more generous, you see a take-up effect, and these take-up effects are quite sizable. So it is actually costly to make disability benefits more generous. And like 10 years ago, the left-hand side has been completely forgotten. Everybody worried about moral hazard. And then the last 10 years, there's been more and more papers trying to estimate actually the value of the benefits. And this is, again, tricky because you don't have data immediately that tell you what the insurance value would be. So you need to do some extra steps where you try to infer based on behavior what this valuation is. And so our paper is exactly doing that. We're going to provide a new method trying to estimate the insurance value based on take-up decisions. So what we do in the paper, we do two things. So the first part is the theory part, where we think about how can we back out the valuation of that $1 of DI recipients, the valuation of $1 of the average taxpayer from observed behavior. And what we show theoretically is that you can actually infer it from take-up responses. And the key thing that's going to come out is that the ratio of the take-up response, if benefits get more generous, relative to the take-up response when wages go down, exactly identifies this ratio of marginal utilities, and that's the insurance value. So with our method, all you need is variation in benefit generosity and variation in wages, and see what happens to take-up, take the ratio of the two, and that gives you the value, the insurance value of disability benefits. And kind of the key contribution relative to existing literature is that this is something that is relatively easy to measure. In admin data, we see disability take-up, and usually you have some variation in benefit generosity. There's some reforms. There might be kinks in the benefit schedule that you could use. There's also a big literature using variation in wages and earnings that you could use to estimate the take-up effects. And so then in the second part of the paper, we take this idea, this theoretical idea that you can use these take-up responses to infer the insurance value to the data, and we estimate the insurance value and the incentive costs in Canada using Canadian data. And then we also do it for the US based on existing estimates from other papers. Okay. And the bottom line of this entire exercise is that it is true that incentive costs are very high. If you increase DI benefits in Canada based on our estimates, it's going to cost you, if you increase it by $1, it's going to cost you $1.6 in total. So there's going to be an additional 60 cents from take-up responses. So people do respond to more generous benefits, and it's going to be costly to increase generosity. But at the same time, if you believe our method, we estimate that the insurance value is even higher. one additional dollar in DI benefits is valued at $2.1. And so the insurance value is higher than the incentive costs. And that means that DI benefits are not too generous. If anything, they're not generous enough. And you could create welfare gains by increasing DI generosity. Okay, and that's the whole paper in a nutshell. If you have any questions, please interrupt or comments or whatever. Now we're going, that was the headline. And now we're going more into the details of how we get there. For the non-economists in the audience, I apologize for the next 5 slides. That's going to be the theory part, and then we're going to go to the empirics. Yeah, but I try to keep it understandable. Okay, so in the theory part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you kind of a standard model of how we think about disability and disability insurance. And I'm going to show you the simplest model and then tell you that the method we provide works in that simple model, but also in more complicated models, and kind of the caveats, what you need to take into account if you think about more complicated models. Okay. But in the simplest model, you have the only thing that differs across individuals is their disability severity. So that's measured by this theta here. So on the x-axis, you have from left to right the severity of disability. So the higher the theta, the more severe your disability is. And then the only choice in that model that you make is whether you work or whether you apply to disability benefits. If you have a very high level of your disability, then it doesn't pay to work because you're incurring these costs of trying to work.
Early because he's showing all these statistics.
Oh, you're muted again.
Oh, go ahead. I'll check it in the chat. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so that's the level of disability on the x-axis. And the only choice you make in that simple model is, do you apply to disability benefits or not? If you don't apply, you're just going to work. And your utility is going to be your utility of consumption, which is going to be the wage you earn minus the taxes you pay, minus these costs you incur from working that depend on your severity. And if you apply, you are medically screened, and then you have a certain probability to get on disability benefits. That's the P. But if you get on, you get this benefit B, and you just consume it, and you don't work at all. So you don't incur the cost of having some work limitation. Okay? And so then there's going to be a cutoff of individuals who want to apply because they're better off if they get on disability benefits relative to working. So there's a big group of individuals who would never apply because it's more attractive for them to work for a given level of benefits. And so then if you apply, you get on with this probability, and then the green area, those are the people who get on disability. There's also going to be individuals who are rejected, and that's kind of capturing the feature of disability insurance that there's medical screening. This screening is imperfect. There's some noise. And so some people get on, some people get rejected. But you would hope that the probability to get on increases with the severity of your disability. If you get rejected, you can choose whether you work or you get on other welfare benefits that are available. Okay. And so now we can think in this simple model, we can think through what happens if you make benefits more generous. So you increase benefit generosity by $1. That's going to be good news for everybody on disability benefits. They get additional money if they qualify for benefits. Okay? And so they're going to value that money by their marginal utility of consumption. Kind of that's their willingness to pay for that one additional dollar. Whatever they do with that money, how much happier do they get because they get the additional money? That's the marginal utility of consumption. And the money is coming from the taxpayer, and they're going to lose that money. They have to finance the more generous disability benefits. And so they value the additional taxes they have to pay at the marginal utility of consumption. So for them, it's a loss, their marginal utility of consumption times the additional money they have to pay, and a gain for those guys on disability benefits. And then next to this effect, there's also a take-up effect, because suddenly it becomes more generous to be on disability benefits. Yeah. So the marginal type, who applies, who doesn't apply, shifts to the left and more people apply. So then you have this take-up effect that's also going to cost you. There's more people on disability benefits. For all these individuals in the red area, you pay them the benefits and you also lose tax revenue from them working. The mechanical cost is just the increase in benefits for all these. Yeah. So there's kind of two cost components if you make disability benefits more generous. One is the additional take-up. There's more people getting on. You have to pay the benefits. You lose the tax revenue from them stopping working. And you have this mechanical effect that if you make them more generous, you pay higher benefits to everybody.
Dr. Hollery, there's
All
a
right.
question in the chat. I'm sorry. Melina, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was just curious because here we have work incentives that allow people to go to work and earn more money, but still receive their benefits. And then depending on how much they make, there's like a sliding scale. Is that something that's available in Norway?
Yeah, that's you. There's a phase out in that you can work kind of, I think it's 50 cents per dollar phase out, and then there's a cut where you lose all the benefits. So
Okay.
that's a kind of a different question to think about. There's other papers on this, kind of the optimal work incentives. How much would you want people to work? Or there's also kind of, there's similar trade-offs if you think about that question. If you make it more, if you can keep more of the money when you work, then being on disability benefits becomes more attractive for able individuals, right? So there could be a take-up effect. But at the same time, there's also a benefit to it that more people work and maybe find their way to the labor market. So there's that's not the topic of today, but that's also a very active literature in economics, thinking about the optimal work incentives on disability benefits.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Cool. All right, but here, like the model here is just very simple, 0, 1. You get on disability benefits, you don't work. I think for a big part of disability insurance programs, that's a good description because very few individuals actually work, or they work very little. All right, and then, I mean, that's the technical bit. What you can show mathematically is that the marginal type is just indifferent between being on disability benefits and working. And so if you do the math, what you see is that the change in take-up when you change benefits relative to the change in take-up when you change wages is exactly this ratio of marginal utilities, and that exactly identifies the insurance value. I think there's no point in going into the math. I think it's better to think about the intuition. Why do we have this result? And it goes a bit against kind of the existing literature, because the existing literature has looked at take-up effects when benefit changes and looked at take-up effects when wages change. And kind of these literatures have always interpreted that strong take-up responses to a change in benefits or a change in wages is kind of a sign of moral hazard, limiting the effectiveness of the disability insurance program. So they always thought about this as something bad, that if we see strong take-up responses, that's just going to make it more costly to run these programs. And there's a lot of people getting on that shouldn't be there. That was kind of the interpretation that has been around for a long time. And now in our paper, we offer a new interpretation, so that actually, if you see very strong take-up responses to benefit generosity, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It really depends on the relative size of the take-up response when you change wages. And the intuition for that result is that if you see if you make a small change in disability benefits and you see a big take-up response, that kind of tells you that suddenly disability became much more attractive because there's a lot of take-up going on. And so the small change triggered a lot of people to get on disability benefits. And that means that their utility must have increased a lot of receiving just these slightly higher benefits. And that means it's extremely valuable to them to get higher benefits. And then on the other hand, if you see the same for wages, if you see a very big response, or if you put it the other way, if a small change in wages substantially reduces DI take-up, that means that just slightly more money when working makes working much more attractive. And so then that would say that you also have a very high marginal utility of consumption when you're working. Yeah? And so if one of the two responses is very big, then the insurance value is very small or very big, depending on the relative size of these things. So if the DI benefit take-up response is very big and you don't see a lot of action if you change wages, that means that the insurance value is very high and that people on disability benefits actually value that money a lot relative to the valuation when they're working. Okay. So that's the key message of the paper. There's these two take-up responses that have very different implications in terms of how to think about welfare implications of disability benefits. All right, and then I presented a very simple model. There's just theta, like one-dimensional disability. The only choice is you work or you apply to disability. It's almost ridiculously simple. And so you might be worried that this is just the result that holds in this very simple model. And so that's actually not true. It holds in a lot of models and models that are much more complicated. The key thing that we actually identify the average insurance value is that the marginal utility of consumption, kind of the valuation, is independent of the disability level. Yeah? So that you value $1 additional the same as somebody who has like a more severe or less severe disability. And you should and you could and should be critical of that assumption. So if marginal utility of consumption is not independent of the level of disability, then what we estimate with our method is the insurance value of the marginal applicant. So the guy on the margin to apply or not apply. Okay? And then what we argue in the paper is that if the insurance value of the marginal applicant might be a lower bound for the average insurance value in the population, because that's the guy on the margin who is indifferent between applying and not. And so we generally think that this individual has kind of a lower insurance value than somebody with a more severe disability. Okay? So if you don't buy the assumption that, maybe you shouldn't buy that assumption that marginal utility of consumption is independent of the disability level, then you can think of our method as providing a lower bound on the insurance value. Yeah. So that's on the theory side, but beyond that, that holds in kind of more complicated models where people have saving choices, where there's life cycle decisions and so on. This is going to go through. The same intuition in more complicated model also holds. And then there's kind of three empirical challenges that we need to address. Because one challenge is that what we actually would need is just variation in wages. And that's very hard to get. What we're going to do is we're going to use a Bartik IV that's using industry shocks across regions to create variation in exogenous variation in earnings. And the problem with this instrumental variable approach is that it not only affects wages, but also maybe employment, that you might have a higher probability to get laid off if you have a recession locally. Okay? It's not just a wage effect, but also an employment effect. And so then what we show here is that if you have both wages and employment effects, what we tend to have empirically, then again, when we identify the insurance value of our method, we have again a lower bound on the insurance value. And the second thing you might be worried about is that we're comparing take-up responses of benefits and wages. using different instruments at different points in time on different populations. And so it could be that there's very different marginal applicants in these two samples. So the wage shock could affect one specific group that has very different take-up responses than the benefit reform that we use in Canada. So if that would be the case, then we would be in trouble because we're just comparing like two different populations. It's not really the same population showing different responses to benefits and wages, but it's different individuals who would have different responses to both of these. Okay. To address that concern, we do a complier analysis. So we look on the characteristics of both compliers to these to the wage shocks and the benefit changes. And what we see there is that they're kind of based on observables, these two groups are actually very similar. So we're not too worried that we're comparing kind of very different population groups against each other, and that's driving our results. And the last thing, what you also need in the model is basically a permanent change in wages and a permanent change in benefits. What you have empirically is we do have a permanent change in benefits, but we only have temporary wage changes from the IV that we use because there's like local recessions that last for a couple of years and then it's gone. And so what we do to address that is we rescale everything by the impact on lifetime income. Because we have a panel of 40 years of data, we can look at the present value lifetime income effect of both the benefit changes and the wage changes. Okay. So that was the run through of the theory. And now we're turning to actually trying to estimate both take-up responses when benefits changes and take-up responses when wages change. And we do this in Canada, and Canada is a nice setup because they have a very particular system. So Canada has these 10 provinces and these 3 territories. Very few people live up here. And the 10 provinces, there's 9 provinces who have the same pension plan. They have the same disability system. And Quebec runs their own pension plan and their own disability insurance program. And then what happened in '87 is that these programs are very similar in many aspects, but the Canadian pension plan, so the red dots, had less generous benefits than the Quebec pension plan until '87. And then in '87, the rest of Canada decided to match the benefits of Quebec and increase them. So you see kind of the lump sum component of the benefit is in Quebec is stable over time. And before '87, the rest of Canada has lower benefits, and then they match the Quebec levels. Yeah. So that's one part of the benefit. And then there's 2 other parts that is income related and family related. And these 2 other parts were already the same in both Quebec and the rest of Canada. Okay. So you have nice variation over time in benefit generosity in the rest of Canada, and Quebec is constant. So we're going to use this in a difference in difference, comparing outcomes over time between rest of Canada and Quebec. And the first figure, just descriptively, is showing you DI benefit receipt in the working age over time. Again, for Quebec, the blue triangles, and rest of Canada, the red dots. Yeah. So you see they move in parallel until '87, then the benefit reform happens, and you see that DI rates are increasing faster in the rest of Canada relative to Quebec. And so that's the idea of the identification strategy, comparing rest of Canada against Quebec over time with a difference in difference. Okay? And if you do that, that's basically just the difference between these 2 bars, just adding some controls and fixed effects for time and province. What you see is, again, parallel trends before the reform. And then starting in '87, when the reform happened, benefits became more generous in the rest of Canada. You see that DI rates are going up. And then by 1995, around 1.2 additional percentage points in disability rates because of the reform. Okay? So you see a take-up effect. And then to have a meaningful interpretation for the comparison to the wage effects, we rescale everything in thousands of dollars in lifetime income. So here you see the take-up effect. If you increase DI benefits in present value by $1,000, you have a take-up effect of 0.2 percentage points. So that alone is not very meaningful, but that's going to be important to make it comparable to the wage effects. And then if you do the elasticity, the elasticity is 0.58 or something. And that's measuring how much more take-up do you see if you increase benefits by 1%. So the answer will be you see 0.6% increase. And then for the total cost, that means it's 1 plus the elasticity over 1 minus disability rate. And so that's where the $1.6 are coming from. So $1 additional is going to cost you, based on our estimates, $1.6 in total. Because there's a sizable effect on take-up if you increase benefits. And so for the wage shocks, we use there's a long literature on Bartik IVs, so we're not doing anything new. What we would want to do is we want to see what's the effect on take-up, the change in DI take-up, if you change lifetime income. And then if you have a panel and you would just regress the right-hand side on the left-hand side without anything, you have a big endogeneity problem, that changes in lifetime income are of course correlated with changes in health and then changes in DI take-up. So you need some exogenous variation in lifetime income. And the way we go is using these instrumental variables, this shift share design, or sometimes called Bartik IV. And the idea of that IV is that based on your industry structure locally, you are differentially exposed to global shocks. So say you are a region where you produce oil and there's an oil price shock, then you are heavily exposed to this positive or negative oil price shocks, and you see big effects on lifetime income because of the oil shock. But if you live in a region where there's no oil at all, you're much less exposed to the oil price shocks. Okay? You might pay more for gas, but you're not losing your job because there's less fracking going on, for instance. Okay? And so that's the idea, that these different industry structures you can use to create local variation in economic booms. And this is basically the whole IV strategy in 2 pictures. So what we do is we use local industry composition and then the national shocks and calculate exposure to these national shocks because of your industry composition. So that's the change in predicted employment growth based on your industry composition regionally. And you see that it's going from, we have variation over these 40 years of data from -8% employment growth over 5 years to +6% in other regions. Okay, so that's always 5-year differences in employment growth predicted by the local industry composition. And what you see is on the left-hand side is here the first stage. So if your predicted employment growth is bigger, then you also have a larger change in lifetime income in thousands of dollars. Okay, so that's what you would expect. If you have a positive economic shock, your lifetime income goes up. And what you also see nicely is that it's almost linear over the entire range of variation that we have. Okay? So that's the first stage of the IV. Just, is there an effect of predicted economic growth on lifetime income? And the answer is yes. Okay, there's a strong first stage. And then on the right-hand side, you see the reduced form. And again, predicted income growth, our instrument on the x-axis, and then the change in the IVC. Okay? And so now what this figure tells you is that if you have a positive economic shock, then you have less DI take-up over the next 5 years. So again, kind of what we would expect based on the literature, that if economic times are good, then you see less take-up of disability benefits. If they're bad, then you see more take-up. All right, and then to put a number on, we do this again in thousands of dollars in lifetime income. And so if you do the industry shift share design, $1,000 increase in earnings, in lifetime earnings, reduces DI take-up by 0.096 percentage points. Okay? And then we're almost done with implementing the formula I showed you at the very beginning, because now if you follow our method, it's just the insurance value is just going to be the take-up effect if you increase benefits by $1,000, that was the 0.2 percentage points, relative to the take-up effects of if you reduce wages, so 0.096. Okay, so the ratio of these two things is this 2.16. Yeah. So the interpretation again is that if you increase benefits by $1, then you're going to create a value of that transfer from the taxpayer to the DI recipients of $2.16. Okay, so a high insurance value, almost $2.2 per dollar spent. And what we already talked about is that based on the take-up effects when you change benefits, that value creation of $2.2 is just going to cost you it was 1.59. I think that's an old number. $1.5, $1.6. And so the conclusion that we had at the beginning is the insurance value is much bigger than the costs of providing these additional benefits. And so benefits are not too generous. All right. And then second to last slide. For the US, we use estimates that already exist from Milligan and Shirley. And if we plug in their estimates in our model, what we get is that it's extremely costly to increase benefit generosity in the US. It's even more costly than in Canada. So if you take their estimates at face value, one additional dollar would cost in total $2.18. Okay? So very strong take-up response. And so it's going to be extremely costly to provide higher disability benefits. But it's even more valuable in Canada than in the US than in Canada. The insurance value that we estimate is $3.44. And so still you create more value than you create costs. And so also the US DI benefits are not too generous based on our method and the estimates from Milligan and Shirley. Okay, I think that's it from my side. So the paper, I hope it made some sense to the non-economists what we're trying to do. And what we do in the paper is trying to figure out the cost and benefit of increasing or reducing DI benefits and having a new method. And the bigger picture conclusion is that the incentive costs are very high. So providing higher benefits is going to be costly, but the benefits of providing these higher benefits are even bigger. And so DI benefits are extremely valuable, and they don't seem to be too generous as they are right now.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Either on the theory or the results, outcomes? I have a large one that, or in my head it's large. It's the recent news here is we've had the big beautiful bill, right, that has impacted our Medicaid and our benefits. Using this, using some of the formulas and the theories that you've shown us today, that's going backwards. I realize that's going backwards. So two-part questions. One is, what is, based on the theory and what you've shown us here today, what would we expect to be the outcomes in terms of take up and benefit, lasting benefits when that happens? And then two, the second part is, how do we take this valuable cost effectiveness evaluation that you've shown us today and use that in awareness campaigns and efforts to prevent reduction of benefits in the future? So no, those are two big ones. I apologize, but
no, that's I think spot on. So I think it's always kind of what I struggle with is selling this to policymakers, because they just see the expenditure side, and so just $1 costs $1.6. That's expensive. Then you need to convince them that actually it's an insurance, so it's all right that this costs money. You're creating more value, and we're trying to communicate this to policymakers, and with more and less success, depending on the political spectrum. But I think the way economists think about insurance is that you need to there's a trade-off. There's obviously a trade-off. It's very easy to make disability benefits cost effective. You just don't provide benefits, right? Nobody's on. super cost effective, but then you don't insure the risk. Yeah. And I think among economists, I think last 10 years changed a lot, that we worry more about the insurance value and kind of these benefits of these insurance systems, much more than we did like 10 years ago. I think in the economics profession, we're on a good way. Using that outside of economics is still sometimes a tough sell, but in the end, like, it's an insurance. So you need to worry about insuring risk and the costs, and you don't get any free lunch. So if you make it more generous, it's going to be more costly. And then it's just a question of whether that you want to spend that money for providing more insurance. But yeah, I think there's plenty of papers now showing that disability benefits are actually very valuable. So you should definitely use that for policymakers as well. That was did that answer the second part?
It did. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And first one was Medicare, Medicaid. You could, I think the general principle applies that we have here, that you have this trade-off incentive and insurance. And kind of the big beautiful bill is not just you make it less generous, but you also kind of cut out eligibility. And then the trade-off is a bit different, because then some people lose a lot because they're no longer eligible. And then you might have very big losses. So you have another paper thinking about the eligibility trade-offs in disability. And I think you could think along these lines also about Medicare, Medicaid. And kind of my sense having done any work on this is that this is a population that values these benefits and this insurance a lot. And so my guess would be that it's a pretty bad idea to cut this down. But you could think along the same lines, and I'm sure there's papers doing that in economics.
thank you. Any other comments or questions? This is economics. Thank you all for doing this work. It's the interpretation, I'm sure, is difficult, particularly with non-economic audiences trying to apply it in certain ways where we see it in action. So this was helpful. And it definitely has
Cool.
taken a hit. West Virginia is not a state with many resources, or the economic resources, and so these formulas are really interesting, and it would be interesting to apply it to West Virginia. We have one of the highest disability rates, and the lowest employment of individuals with disabilities. So in so many different ways, it would be interesting. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you staying later and incorporating us into your day, and your work is really interesting. We'll continue to watch it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care. And
Yeah, you
everyone,
too.
I will put an evaluation in the chat if you're able to stay on for a little bit, and we appreciate your time too. Thank you.
Okay. See you.